All right, so you definitely, clutch was definitely slipping on track like you said it was.
All right, we're here with Steve from XClutch. I'm super excited because he's going to evaluate my clutch, tell you guys some things that you've all been asking about clutches, like service life wear, what a slipped clutch actually looks like. I will be able to show you this. And he'll answer some questions that he gets from a lot of you guys, and hopefully you guys find it informative.
All right, you definitely, clutch was definitely slipping on track like you said it was.
I mean, it's been 2.5 years. To be fair, it's been 2.5 years on like 660 horsepower. We detuned it last year to try to give it some life.
Yeah, I mean, definitely at like 600 plus track duty, twin organic is you're kind of at the top of where we recommend it. But given that, I mean, I think it had a pretty good life.
Awesome.
I'm not sure how many events you did, but at 600 plus wheel horsepower in a racing condition, like you're asking a lot out of this clutch. Had a look at it a little bit already, and this is what I would say is just a typical worn out clutch where it's served its purpose. It's just the disc have worn down enough to where the pressure plate isn't able to exert enough clamp load to allow the clutch to operate as it should. And as a result, when you said you're driving it hard and got some heat into it, it would slip a bit. And then you said it cooled down a little bit and you can drive around town and that sort of stuff, and it was fine, which is typical of what you see for how much this clutch is worn. It looks like there's still material left, but there's a service limit to how much wear that both discs can have before the pressure plate is unable to do its job, and you're just past that mark on this clutch.
Can you explain how you see that? Because I know there's a lot of stipulations, and people will look at this, like you said, and be like, there's plenty of meat on this. Like, how do you tell? No, there's not.
Well, like I said, so there's a certain stack up that the clutch needs to have for the pressure plate to do its job. Typically, there's a service limit to the thickness of the disc, and what this clutch is about 1.5 mil, and I think we got about 1.6, 1.7 of wear on this clutch itself after kind of looking at it. If you were making less power than you were, maybe the clutch wouldn't have slipped as much or as soon. You maybe got a little bit more life out of it, but being the off season, it's a good time to look at these sort of things and find this sort of stuff out. And then the other aspect is the disc gets thin and it has a hard time with the heat.
Right.
And then it just thermal overloads, and then you lose some of the friction coefficient of the material when it gets to a certain temperature. Once the clutch slips, it generates a lot of heat. So if you're on track and it slipped a bit, and then the road course stuff, you really don't have a lot of time for the clutch to cool off.
Right.
So once it gets hot, and then you're shifting again a few times, and it's going to get hot and stay hot. You probably could have let it cool down and went back out, and it probably would have been better. I guess if you overheat the clutch, the best thing to do is just drive with the clutch pedal down, the clutch disengaged, so everything separates.
Okay.
And it gets air into it and kind of helps cool down. Like, say if this was a ceramic puck style disc, you might not have seen the clutch slip at this power level just because it has a higher friction coefficient and a higher thermal capacity. At like the same thickness, the clutch might have been fine for whatever, but depending on how many events you got going on this year, it could have been something you need to service mid-season.
Right. We got 8 this year, so
not a fun job to do.
We need it.
Looking at like the pressure plate cap, these hot spots, the heat checking, typical for this style of clutch and this style of organic disc. You'll see this just from normal driving with the twin disc and a lot of the higher performance organic clutch kits. You're removing the Marcel spring, or as some of the Marcel between the two facings, so the clutch engages a lot quicker. Has a shorter engagement window than like a OEM style. It's got a lot of Marcel to it, so as a result you get this heat checking. However, like the slipping aspect of it, you can kind of see here where you have these wide marks, and it's discolored the casting a bit. This is definitely a sign that the clutch was slipping. If it was just heat checking, you're not gonna, it's not something you see typical of a clutch slipping.
Okay.
And then if you're looking at like the facings itself, it's got a bit of a glaze to it.
Yeah, we see that. Yep.
And then we saw on the intermediate plate here, again, you're seeing the heat checking. This intermediate plate typically will have some discoloration to it, just because it's the thinnest piece of the 3 on this style of clutch. But nothing to be too concerned about. I put a straight edge across it. It was tapered a bit, but not enough to, I wouldn't put new disc in it and use it, but it's not atypical is I guess what I'm saying.
Okay.
Again, you're seeing the hot spotting from just the regular clutch engagement on both sides. and then you're seeing this big swath here of discoloration, which is sign that the clutch was slipping. And if you're looking at the disc, this disc would have been sitting there. So this facing was what was slipping against this side here.
Gotcha.
And you see this side looks a bit better because you can still see some of the fiber, the material there. But then you look at this side of the disc, and there's spots of it like here and a bit here where it's really shiny and kind of glazed over, which is typical for an organic facing when it gets hot. Like it deteriorates the facing a little bit. And again, you lose a little bit of the friction coefficient of the material when you get to that aspect of it. But again, it's just the clutch that's had a really good service life. Nothing, like I said, nothing out of the ordinary. The slipping is what you would see. And there's a bit more of it on this facing on the lower disc is what you would see on the back side of this facing, because this ring sits in like this. And you can see a little bit of the slipping again on the inside. And it's usually you see it slip from the inside out, and that's because like the material wears, and then the steels tend to dish as they get a little bit of heat to them. And if you put straight edge to this, you would see that there's a little bit of a taper. Same thing with the flywheel and the pressure plate. They all have a little bit of taper. Usually they taper kind of in from out, and I'm not really sure why, but I'm sure it has something to do with the heat characteristics or whatever. I don't know. I'm not an engineer when it comes to this sort of stuff. So, but I've looked at a lot of these clutches over my career, and you see certain things like the wear is always there, and the wear is why you don't just replace a disc.
Right.
Because these facings all have a taper to them now, and unless it's corrected, we don't recommend machining the intermediate plate or the pressure plate, but you can machine the flywheel. But if you just put new disc into this, then those new discs are only gonna wear and make partial contact where the taper on the steels are. These dampers all wear a little bit, so it's not uncommon to see some of these springs have a little bit of movement to them after they've been used, because as the engine's running, this damper's
constantly
rattling. On throttle it's one way, on coast it's the other way, so this damper's constantly doing this, and even they all wear a bit as it goes. Really, Devin, it's just the clutch is just worn out in this aspect. Other thing, the release bearing. We pulled the release bearing out. You can see the ears are kind of bent out.
Yeah, okay, yep.
It could be the way that the installer installed the fork, which we see a lot, where they install the bearing to the pressure plate and then they fish the fork in. If it's not like square, it can force the ears out.
Okay.
So all the force to the bearing when the clutch is being actuated is on these sections here. There's really no, the ears are just locate the bearing on the fork. But this it's got a little tear starting right here.
Oh yeah, it does.
It's just been a matter of time before this would have eventually broke. But again, there's not a lot of, once the clutch is installed and the bearing is installed to the clutch itself, there's not a lot of movement with the bearing. Like it's not jouncing around in there, and there's no side load or load forward that you'd put on the ears. I see this quite a bit, and I don't know if this is an NTN OEM bearings. This sometimes I think can happen during installation, and I think sometimes it can happen when pulling the gearbox out. So but if you see something like this, it's definitely spend the 60 bucks and put a new bearing in it. They come with, for this clutch, it would be both disc, the intermediate plate, a new pressure plate, a new release bearing, and a new alignment tool.
Sweet.
And then all you would need to do was just machine the flywheel. The chromoly steel flywheels are very resilient. I think I measured this, it only had about 1.5 mil in taper between the two sides, which over the life of the clutch in a couple years and track time and that sort of stuff, which it's an OEM cast steel flywheel or an aluminum flywheel with a steel insert, you'd see a lot more of that. So these are just really good. You could probably get a couple services out of these before they get too thin.
Awesome.
I mentioned before that the clutch is just worn out, and the reasoning for that is the disc thickness. Again, there's a stack up of this that this needs to have to exert the clamp load that it needs to hold the power that it does. One way to determine that is you can measure You can assemble the clutch and you can measure the diaphragm spring location, but you'd have to have it noted what it was when it was new.
Okay.
And you can kind of deduct that from here. The other method is just measuring the thickness of the disc. So I mentioned that there's lack of Marcel in these discs.
Yeah.
Or a lot less. Typically, like in a single plate or an OEM disc, you'd see a half of a mil, maybe more of Marcel. So that's spread. There's a little spring that's in between here.
Okay.
This is what this is riveted to. And that Marcel acts as like a cushion for engagement. So when it's clamping back down, it allows the facings to make a soft contact. And then that last bit is when it engages. It helps from shuttering and makes the drivability smooth. But in a performance application, it can make the engagement slow. You take some of the Marcel out of it, and it allows it to engage quicker. And then these discs have a steel backing to the friction material, which helps with heat capacity as well as high RPM, like burst strength for the material. When you're measuring these, you want to compress that Marcel, right? So you want to get the complete thickness on it.
Okay.
It's just a matter of, you can either, if you have small clamps or if somebody else just hold it, or if you can just give it a good squeeze. You can see just on this 7.4.
Yeah.
And if I give it a squeeze, it comes down to like 7.2.
Right.
7.24 or whatever. And then back out to like its rested state is 7.4. So you got about 0.2 of a Marcel, which is about right. But this disc, when it's new, compressed, is 8 millimeters.
All right.
So you can see here, this one's got about 0.6, 0.8 wear. And again, when I was talking about the taper, you'll see that like the disc is going to be, it's thinner on the outer edge, and then the inner edge here is a bit thicker.
Right. Okay.
And you'll see that on all of the discs. They wear that way, and that's just how a clutch wears. And you know, part of the reason for the break-in. So like if you're looking at this, and then for a multi-disc, when measuring the thickness of trying to figure out how much life is left, or you know where you're at with the clutch itself, it's a matter of taking the wear from all the discs and adding them up. Where a single plate, like you're just looking at one disc, and it's
right.
Okay, well, it's 1.5 mil. So if it's 8 new, 6.5, it's considered discard.
Right.
That one was 7.2.
Right.
7.3. So we're talking 3/4 of a millimeter of wear on that disc. And then this one again, typically that top disc is going to wear more than the bottom disc. And this one here is at 7.2, 7.3 on the outside. If you go towards the middle, it's difficult with this, but 7.4. So this one's down 0.6. So you're right at that 1.5.
Okay.
If you take an average, if I measured it more, I had different style of caliper, I could get more technical with it, but it's not needed for this. So it's clutch is worn.
Yeah.
You're making more power than it can hold at this stage of its life, and so we're just going to replace it.
Right. All right. Thank you.